You're listening to the Autism Weekly podcast. Each week we share community voices and bring light to stories that increase awareness, acceptance, equity, access, and inclusion. If you haven't already, subscribe to join the Autism Weekly family. I'm your host, Jeff Skibitsky. This week we're joined by Dr. Klin, the director of the Marcus Autism Center and a leading expert in autism research. We'll be discussing his groundbreaking work with Dr. Warren Jones, utilizing eye tracking technology to visualize and measure social engagement in individuals with autism. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Klin.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure.
Well, you've been doing a lot of research, and you're heading up one of the foremost respected research institutions with the Marcus Autism Center. But what led you down that line? What brought you into the field of autism and the field of discovery within autism?
Well, I believe that I worked with children for most of my adult life. And from very early on, I began to work with children with developmental concerns, the children with disabilities. That was my clinical passion. Alongside that, I was always interested in the emergence of mind, in the development of the brain, particularly the social brain, how we engage with others, how we learn to read their minds and to establish relationships. And autism became really a wonderful opportunity for me to merge those two interests, because children with autism come into this world with an attenuated, a diminished sense of the other. And because of that, there is a disruption of the normative process of socialization, and the results thereof becomes autism. So I was always fascinated by these children, and I was always fascinated by the emergence of the social brain. And in a way, autism gave me an opportunity to try and make a contribution, hopefully, to both sides of the equation.
Well, it sounds like you're already doing that and well on your way for more, but where did the emergence of technology come in? Because a lot of what you're describing right now seems like, I guess the biophysical, the way the neurological components are working, but this next chapter seems like it's very technologically advanced for this field.
Well, technology is a tool. Our very best ideas for our research comes really from our playrooms, come from our attempt to understand children and in order to be support to them and to their families. The idea of studying social visual engagement, which is the way that we look at and learn about the world, came also from a playroom. I remember well, this little girl, she was only 15 months of age. At the time, she was the youngest child ever diagnosed with autism. This is my time at Yale. I spent 20 years there and directed the program eventually. But that little girl in that room, I remember so well that I could come so close to her eyes to the point of actually being 2 inches from her nose. And she seemed to be living really in a world of her own. At the same time, maybe 5 minutes later, she might see something at the corner of the room, and she might crawl there, and all of a sudden I'll find out that she found an M&M. And so the M&M 5 feet away was of greater value to her than I was, standing 2 inches from her eyes. So what she showed me is that there is a different way of being in this world, a world in which maybe sometimes things are more salient than people. And my quest, of course, was trying to step into her mind and see the world through her eyes. And we do so as clinicians intuitively. We're kind of walking laboratories of social engagement. We feel another person. But of course, at the time, my mentor, a gentleman called Donald Cohen, who was a pioneer in research of autism, asked me, how can you elevate this intuition, this clinical intuition, to the plane of science? And for that, we needed measurement. And for that, we needed technology.
Mhm.
And the way that we do that is using eye tracking technology, which allows us to measure the way that a child looks at and learns about the world at a rate of 120 times a second. And in
Oh,
this
wow.
way, we can quantify a process and study it properly. But that's the origin of our interest in using eye tracking technology.
I mean, that's a lot of data that you're able to access there. If what you're saying is that the eye tracking technology is able to pick up on that much nuance, that much of what's occurring on a regular basis. And I love the fact that your origin getting into everything was really just focusing on, what's the perspective of somebody else's lived experience. And I think that is, when I'm thinking about neurodiversity and I'm thinking about autism, it's kind of like a microcosm of the whole world. Is like, we all are better if what we're doing is trying to understand how somebody else is perceiving the world around us and helping to empower them more, which it sounds like this is really kind of the focus of what drew you. But so you mentioned that you're working on the eye tracking diagnostic software. And this is through, if I'm correct, Early Tech Diagnostics. And you have another colleague who has been working alongside you there, Dr. Warren Jones. And how did you all connect? Because it sounds like this is a very powerful relationship.
I appreciate that. That's been the privilege of my professional life. Warren was a student at Yale in mechanical engineering and art. And in many different ways, he used at the time science to inform his art. And he picked me up as a mentor for a project that he was doing towards his last year in college. When I saw the projects that he was working on, I immediately thought that this person would not go anywhere else. We're going to work together, and we're going to try and bring together in an act of co-creation a new way of doing exactly what you stated before, seeing the world through the eyes of others. Somehow in our society, it's often difficult for us to step out of ourselves and see the world through different perspectives. And yet, autism presented this uniquely human opportunity for us to see what the world feels like, looks like, is experienced like from a perspective different from our own. So Warren and I then began to work together at Yale. In fact, he used to, as I said, he used to use science to inform his art. For the past 25 years or so, he has done the opposite, which is now using art to make his science much more easily communicated and seen. And the work began, in fact, with adults. At the time, I was running a social skills group for adults with autism. And with those individuals, life was really lived on their daily stories, one day at a time. And I had a passion, in fact, for a particular play, a theater play, which eventually became a movie. And that was Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, who won an Oscar in 1966. And the entire plot was inside the head of two couples. And the entire movie happens as an act of minds fencing against one another. And so as a fun activity, the social skills group, we would sometimes read from that play. Now, with Warren being equally sort of fond of art and movies and things of that nature, we decided to try for the first time to see how those individuals would watch something as complex as Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. And that study became our very first two publications. And the notion was indeed that we can all be exposed to the same scenes, but the way that we are co-creating that experience, what we're looking at and learning about, is very, very different indeed. And from
Mhm.
there, Warren and I, who eventually went to study neuroscience at the Yale School of Medicine, so he became a neuroscientist. We start doing more and more studies and getting more and more research grants, and eventually became apparent to us that the work that we were doing, and particularly the work that Warren had so beautifully invented, which was how do we quantify that from a math standpoint? How do you take the way that one individual or a group of individuals are looking at a video, and how can we quantify that? When those solutions became apparent, and those things were really showing some light, not only on the adults, but then the school-age children, all the way to babies. We realized that maybe we have some science that we can leverage for the purpose of addressing a major public health challenge. And at the time, we're both still at Yale. There was this major frustration with the fact that we might at Yale see individuals from other parts of the world that would come to Yale for, say, for diagnostics, but we wouldn't see children who were only 2 blocks away from inner city New Haven. We really found out that access to diagnostic services is extremely limited, and it generates major healthcare disparities for minority, low-income, and rural families. So we have to find a way of turning this clinical service diagnostics, which is something that is required for a child to have access to eligibility for treatment and then to receive treatment. We had to democratize this process. We had to create something that might be a proxy for somebody like me, an expert clinician who takes 10 hours to evaluate a child. Well, there are not many expert clinicians in this country, and those evaluations are extremely expensive. So how could we leverage the science to create a tool that would accomplish high quality diagnostic services in a standardized, objective, quantitative, but most importantly, community viable fashion? So when that happened, we realized that we were on a path to try and develop a device, something that could be deployed anywhere and something that would greatly increase access to those services. So that's the path that we set to ourselves. And then 14, 15 years later, here we are. We have that tool.
Well, I mean, it sounds like you start from art, move into science, straight into mathematics, and then you're looking at being able to kind of figure out some social programming for us as a society to start implementing to tackle some of the real life problems. But as you went through this, I mean, you mentioned earlier data. You mentioned that, we have a lack of clinicians that are available out there. You're talking about that gap between, where you can really start to make a difference in somebody's lives now being prolonged because they're on wait lists. They're waiting for treatment. But also is that you're taking what has historically been a relatively subjective diagnosis, and you're starting to put some objective parameters around it with the data sets that you're capturing. So when you're looking at all these pieces coming together, would it be safe to assume that, I mean, we're not only looking at access to care and efficiency, but we're also looking at maybe changing the landscape of how we diagnose and looking at it more from objective viewpoints?
Yes. I know that you have parents who watch this podcast. So let me say a few sentences so that I can then, in a way, contextualize my answer to your second question. Right now, only 1 in 5 children with autism in this country is diagnosed before the age of 3 years. Many, many, many years of science have shown this, that were we to be able to identify, diagnose, and intervene in the lives of individuals with autism, we have an opportunity to optimize their outcomes for their lives. And yet in this country, the median age, or 50% of the population, is diagnosed only when they are in school. By that time, autism has aggravated. Now, the problem is no longer autism, is really the burdens of autism, the intellectual disability, the language disability, the severe behavior challenges. Now, we believe that for the vast majority of our children, we can actually optimize their outcomes so that these children can fulfill their promise and their families can enjoy a life that is better than the one that that previous generations had. And I'll leave that portion of my background with one stark statistic. If nothing else, please keep that in mind. Right now, if you're a Black child with autism in this country, you are at double the risk for intellectual disability than a white child with autism. And this does not have to do with genetics or ancestry. It has to do with limited access to services. So I usually ask clinicians when I'm introducing the tool, is something that I just told you, is this acceptable? Is this ethical? And is this equitable? Because if it is not, we need change. And now I'm going to get to the second part of your question. In most fields of medicine, real advance happened when there was a discovery of a biomarker. A biomarker is a measurement of the condition that you're interested in. It is objective, it is standardized, and it does the same thing every time that you deploy it, okay? We, in medicine in general, but certainly in autism, diagnosis, when it depends exclusively on the expertise and experience of one person, you have immediately two problems. Problem number one is one of access, because there are not many expert clinicians. But you also have the problem of subjectivity. And the problem of subjectivity means that lying immediately behind you is the specter of implicit bias. And one of the things that is emerging in the field is that because the tools, the observational tools that we have been used for a long time for the diagnosis of autism, were not standardized on minorities. For that matter, they are not standardized on females either, because autism used to be primarily white middle-class boys with very specific and marked sets of symptoms. With the years, we are finally getting things right. We realize that autism is a much broader spectrum and impacts every single community that anybody has ever bothered to look into. But if the tools have not been standardized in those populations, if the expert clinicians have not had enough experience with those populations, next, what happens? What happens is bias. And this is not unique to autism. Is something that is much more of a generalized challenge in medicine in general, but certainly is the case with autism because of what autism is. Autism is first and foremost a social disability. So we are not necessarily measuring a protein that may lead to cancer. What we are measuring is the ability or lack thereof in establishing relationships with others, in engaging with others in a way that is reciprocal, in being able to understand other people's emotions and intentions and thoughts and beliefs and false beliefs. So autism, even though it is a biological liability, it's a genetic trait, really. The fact is that the condition itself, it comes into vision in the context of social interaction. So if you believe that maybe social interactions and perceptions thereof are not entirely objective, then the diagnosis of autism is not entirely objective. And
Mhm.
that's one of the major advantages of having a biomarker. And in other fields of medicine, like cancer and cardiology, most, let's say, discoveries and improvements, including improvement of care, came from the discovery of biomarkers. But in the field of
Mhm.
autism, these biomarkers have been slow in coming. And that's one of the reasons why we focus so much of our attention in, in developing and validating the importance of something that may look to others as very ephemeral, very fragile, the way we look at and learn about the world. And yet, this is the foundation of socialization. Speech, language, communication, all of those things emerge out of the fact that in primates, babies are born with the need for caregiving. And so without the caregiving of others, they wouldn't survive. And
Mhm.
Mother Nature basically co-opted that survival context to put in everything that is needed for babies to acquire a mind and the ability to communicate reciprocally with others. And autism represents the disruption of that process.
Well, I appreciate the fact that, I mean, the overarching concern is the equity in healthcare, is that we're trying to right now be able to take out the bias, being able to understand the cultural nuances to maybe what we're seeing as far as, what is being perceived, what is the output of somebody's social communication, how that is affected by how they, what their culture was, what their upbringing was, and the gender differences. And I think the tool that you all are creating and the way that it's being processed helps to kind of mediate some of that. But how does the eye tracking diagnostic software, how does it even work? I mean, what is the premise behind it? What is how does that start to give us more information?
Um, Social interaction from the time that we are days and weeks of life all the way to the time that we're buried is something that happens very, very quickly. We call this intuition. We have a feeling for others. But what in fact is happening is that we are exquisitely attuned to the minutest of cues that come from another person's face, another person's eyes, a person's gestures, a person's posture, let alone the nuances of a person's voice and intentionality and all of those kinds of things. So people say that social stimuli, like for example experienced in social interaction, is very complex. Is very complex, but babies do extremely well. In fact, primates do extremely well. But yes, there are lots of things going on. So in the life of, say, a little toddler, okay, as the toddler is exposed to two other toddlers, say, interacting in front of them, like in a daycare, there are moment by moment hot spots of socialization. These are specific things that are happening at a particular spot at a particular time that are critical for social learning. So these hot spots of socialization, they are what we call not only forces of enculturation, that are opportunities for social learning. Okay? 80%, typically developing toddlers will watch these complex scenes of social interaction. 80% of the time, they're going to be looking at the same place at the same time. Now you have toddlers with autism watching the same scenes. And what you have is that there are hundreds, in fact, thousands of moment by moment divergences, meaning they are looking at different places at different times. So they are not, in a way, part of this enculturation, entrainment force that happens, that is part of our biology. So imagine that in our device procedure, for example, 10 to 12 minutes of video watching, these children are diverging. They are missing literally thousands of opportunities of social learning. Now, they are not missing those thousands of opportunities of social learning in our experiment only. This is the way they're living life. And so in the first 2 to 3 years of life, there is an accrual of hundreds and hundreds, if not millions, of missed opportunities of social learning. That is autism. So the reason why this device works is because as a clinician, I may observe a child a few times over the course of a play session, say for lasting 40, 50 minutes. I may observe a few opportunities of whether or not the child looked at my eyes, or when I pointed somewhere, if the child followed. All of those are particular skills that are key for the acquisition of speech language communication. But as a human being, I'm able to only observe a few of those. But with this technology, we're measuring 120 times a second those phenomena. So you end up with this enormous quantification that you obtain very quickly in a few minutes of video watching. And the reason why it has worked so well diagnostically is because our kids, the kids with autism, are diverging so many times that we could mine these thousands of divergencies to actually proxy the diagnosis given by an expert clinician after completion of a, say, 6 to 10 hour evaluation. So that's the power. That's the power of that science. Now, we were able to go further, because if I'm a clinician and I want to create a program of treatment for a child, that child needs more than just a diagnosis, because autism is a very large spectrum. So we also wanted to create indices or severity indices of a child's level of autism and the child's level of verbal and nonverbal learning. With those indices, I can create a profile that will allow me to make a decision. What is the treatment that this child needs, the modality of treatment, and the intensity of treatment? And that's what the device currently does. The procedure is basically, say, a toddler watching movies up to 10 to 12 minutes. And 10 to 15 minutes later, a clinical report is issued to a secure portal that the clinician can access. And in that report, you have a diagnostic classifier. Does the child have autism or does not? But also a measure of their autism, how severe it is, and their verbal and nonverbal ability. So that's the functionality they were looking for, so that we could provide somebody working with that child with as much information as one could within a very short period of time.
So you definitely have piqued my interest now, because as you were describing that, my original thoughts were, what's the sensitivity of the tool? Are you able to actually get the levels based off the DSM criterion? But you opened up a brand new door here of the verbal and nonverbal components of learnings. How does that work? I mean, how is it that through eye tracking, you're able to pull off that much information to be able to give the guidance on those sorts of treatment recommendations?
Yeah, so there are 3 severity indices: social disability, verbal ability, and nonverbal ability. How do you measure something without measuring it directly? People are not fully aware, but in medicine, you have a lot of tools that do exactly that. For example, the oximeter, that gives you level of oxygen in your bloodstream and your pulse. That little thing that you put in your finger do neither. What it does is that collects information that allows you to do some transformations and generate data that is entirely reliable in producing those 2 measures. In science, in the science of the mind and science of the brain, we have something very similar. So how do we measure verbal and nonverbal? Well, what happens is this. I mentioned to you that the foundation of the acquisition of speech and language and communication is reciprocal social interaction. Okay, so underneath what you hear and what you see is the way that we engage with others reciprocally. That's the developmental science piece. Okay, but it is also the case that the way that you interact with others, or for that matter, that you watch a scene of others interacting, that the way that you see that video reflects the capacities that you already have. And so in many different ways, I basically I measure in the way that a child is not only responding to something that is happening in front of them, but is already predicting what is the right behavior given what they just observed. So what we do, and this is a sort of a short, general, sort of overarching answer to your question, is that the way that we watch the world around us reflect both our abilities, our verbal ability, the way that where we are in language acquisition, but also our non-verbal abilities, the way that we kind of solve puzzles in the world, because the more we know, the faster we get to certain places, and all of that is reflected in our eyes, in the way that we see the world. The eyes are not only the window to the soul, they are the window to social neuroscience, to the social brain. That's the overarching response. The evidence-based response is that those indices that I've just mentioned were replicated now about 5 times, 5 different studies, which basically means that empirically, we can say that those measures are very reliable proxies of the measures that an expert clinician would take using an observational tool, doing the kinds of things that that clinicians do in their playrooms. We feel very comfortable about that. The answer moment by moment is actually much more exciting, but much more difficult for me to give you in 10 seconds.
It sounds like your research and your publications could be a deeper dive into a lot of those subjects. So, but one of the things that you've been able to do through research is that you have a variety of community partners and research partners that have been involved that have treatment arms to it. That, I mean, obviously you're working with children, so you have parental feedback to this process. What is it that you're hearing from both the clinical teams that have been utilizing the tool and maybe are getting those treatment results and how they're able to use them, and from the parents on, how empowered they might feel from the additional information, feedback information, efficiency?
Parents are, and I'm speaking to parents, I'm usually, your podcast probably reaches out to parents whose children have been diagnosed with autism. But there is a very large group of parents out there that are voiceless. In the state of Georgia alone, and it's the same thing universally, there are every year about 3,500 toddlers who were screened positive for autism by their pediatricians, who use a paper and pencil screen. And the state is capable of giving diagnosis, access to diagnosis, to sometimes less than 10% of the population. So imagine thousands of parents who go home every day that somebody told them that your child might have autism. They have heard the CDC, ourselves, and the entire community saying that earlier is better, and yet they can't get the answer. They don't have access to that answer. I don't know many conditions in medicine in which you have the same situation. It's unethical to screen for something that you cannot do something about it. So this is the first thing. And unfortunately, there's thousands and thousands of families. Imagine that in this country, 100,000 children are born every year who will have autism. So we're talking about many, many thousands of families who are deprived of the services. They are voiceless. They basically don't act as a stakeholder because they are not organized. There is no social media platform. There is no organizing factor bringing that extraordinary burden that they are experiencing right now to the fore, so that all of us are held accountable for what they're going through privately as parents. So that's the first thing. I think that if you speak to parents, parents will tell you about the diagnostic odyssey in autism, the fact that it takes years for them to access services. So that's one piece. One interesting piece that has happened, that feedback that parents have been giving us, is that this report, this clinical report, and this tool is being used in some 26 centers around the country right now, in some 16 states, in fact, as well. This clinical report that is issued by after the completion of the procedure with the device has those quantitative measurements of everything that was done, the diagnosis, the positive predictive value, the negative predictive value. This is basically quantitative probability that the device is correct for that child, as well as those indices of severity that I mentioned. But there is something else that is done. And that something else is basically 2 illustrations that are specific to that child, of 2 frames of video that are taken from what they watched, what is the typical pattern of viewing, and then their own child. And they find this a very powerful experience because they always ask themselves, I know that Joey is different, but I wish I could be Joey for 10 seconds so that I can get some insight into what goes in his mind and what kind of challenges does he have as he's trying to navigate the demands of everyday life. So for those illustrations, now they can see what Joey is missing and the way that Joey is going about co-creating in his mind the world around him. And that is a very powerful way of engaging families in what needs to happen next. And what needs to happen next is the intervention, is the treatment, is the support, is the therapeutic education that the child needs to receive. And they also get a sense that they are looking, in that report, they're looking at 2 illustrations, but they are fully aware that those 2 illustrations are telling them about things that happen hundreds, if not thousands of times within 10 to 12 minutes of video watching. So, parents are our greatest stakeholders. If the ecosystem of care for our children depended on parents, we'll be in a completely different place. But parents can actually make change happen in this field. I would say that most of the critical advances for services for kids with autism and adolescents and adults really came from the hard work of parents, including the educational laws, changing coverage, and we still have huge gaps. We're talking primarily about young children today, but if you are a parent of a significantly challenged young adult, the precipice of service is extraordinary, and the educational laws evanescent thin air. So all of those services that the child must have been receiving through school now go away, and then that now young adult is back home and going trying to find out the services that individual need in order to have good quality of life and fulfill their promise. So, but I'll say this is the largest center, the largest academic center serving kids with autism. We have the largest program for the treatment of severe behavior challenges. These are challenges that often land some of our kids in neurology. We treat things such as elopement, which is wandering away, the second most common form of premature death in individuals with autism with intellectual disability. And some of our treatment requires 4 adults per child or adolescent. It may cost up to $60,000 over the course of a period of maybe 4 to 6 months, but we are able to get these children back to their homes and their communities and so forth. That's wonderful. But access to such a program is absolutely very limited. When I then go to another floor of our building and I see the little guys, and I see the early intervention that is going on now with 12-month-olders and 14-month-olders and 24-month-olders, I ask myself the question, is what I saw on the second floor inevitable? Really, really. So nothing, nothing should sharpen people's ideas about autism than basically going and seeing our treatment programs for those for those challenged kids, and then go downstairs and see that maybe that story could have been rewritten. And it's really up to us as to whether or not we want to have more of that outcome that will require those expensive intensive treatments, or more and more children who are able to be in inclusive preschools to learn and acquire the skills necessary for eventually to have a life with meaningful relationships, with independence and fulfillment. We are deep believers that we can change the narrative of this condition from one of disability to one of possibility and promise. That means diversity. That means that there is room in this world for individuals with different ways of being human. Because, who are we to say? I am obsessed about people, so maybe I'm not such a good mathematician or technician. Well, if I was less obsessed about people, maybe I'll be making my contribution in life in a different way. Well, those individuals with autism have a different way of being in this world, and were we to be able to provide them with the resources, or to afford them the resources they need in order to find the best of themselves, I feel that this world will be a better one. But it all starts with the question: when we see these children early on, are we, from a societal standpoint, are we interested in making the investment that is needed? And that means change. Doing the same over and over ain't gonna change anything. And you asked me even before we began to record this, what is this journey like? Well, you can have all the solutions in the world, science-based solutions, clinically validated solutions, but until they are available to those who need it, where they are and when they need it, that journey continues.
Well, I mean, even the way you were describing that, the polarity of experience of those young children developing some of the skills that empower them to live the life that they would like to live, is that we can't tell them what life they should be living, and nor should we, but we can empower them to explore the world the way that they would like to, versus the quality of life of somebody who is in a, I guess, hospitalized sort of setting where, it's to the point where, their safety, their health is constantly at risk. It's hard not to go back and say, why in the world are we not doing all we can to be able to empower children younger to live the life that they would like to be able to experience? And it sounds like the tool that you're developing will be doing that. It will be providing the opportunity to diagnose earlier, which gives more information. And hopefully that trickles down to the treatment access, and the treatment providers are out there. But where do you see, I mean, you've right now already gotten to the point where your journey through research, you've gone through 5 replication studies, you have FDA approval for the research. What are the next steps? Because you probably have a variety of clinicians and families saying, yes, there's 26 sites out there doing it, but that's not enough. I mean, we need more. We need more access to tools like this. Where do we go?
Indeed. Well, there is the work of actually changing healthcare. For that, you need pivotal gains. The pivotal gains are major centers adopting it, and some are beginning to do so. the greatest change is going to come from the coverage system, particularly Medicaid. Accepts that they have a problem in their hands and that they need to do something about it. I can work for the next 250 years by myself, together with Warren Jones and some of the people who have joined us to do this. And we are not going to have as much impact in our society as Medicaid changing a couple of lines of their coverage policy. So that's the bottom line. If Medicaid decides to address this problem, they can. And with Medicaid comes all of the other insurance companies that look to Medicaid for best practices in this field. So that's the not so interesting and yet crucial aspect of this work. From a scientific and clinical standpoint, the next steps are clear to us. And there are several clinical trials underway, and we probably should be seeing this work completed within the next year or so. Number one, Warren and I prioritize a very young age, 16 to 30 months, because of the promise of early intervention. And by the way, we already have community viable treatments. We already do. So that's not an excuse. And we have a federal mandate as well to provide those community viable treatments. So that's not an excuse. But we prioritize that, even though, of course, that's the most difficult part of our work, because young children are still growing up. A 2-year-old, say, a 2-year-old with autism looks very different than a 16-year-old with autism. But we tackle this more difficult piece because of the promise that early intervention affords us all. But the fact is that 4 in every 5 children in this country is still being diagnosed at a later age. So one of the trials was an age extension, going from 16 months to all the way to 7 years, so that we can make this available for all the children. Then there is another little challenge in the world that we live in. It's that a lot of our kids who do receive treatment, they may have treatment for a period of time, but nobody is necessarily monitoring if the child is benefiting from that treatment, if there are adjustments that need to be made. There are no cost-effective ways, objective ways, of measuring what we call treatment response. It had this, because we don't have that, there are a million things that unfortunately happen. People don't conduct many clinical trials of new drugs because you don't have a quantitative way of measuring response. You need very large trials. It's too expensive. People don't invest. But for our children, okay, clinically, they often receive treatment for which there is no measurement, or the measurements are quite subjective, or they cannot be standardized. So you cannot compare, for example, the needs of one child relative to the needs of another child. And if I'm an insurance provider, I should know if Billy needs more or less than Joey, if we're talking about tens and tens of thousands of dollars. So we don't have that. So 2 of the trials focus on the same science and technology as a biomarker for treatment response, change over time. One of them focusing on the young children, 16 to 30 months, and the second one from 30 months to 7 years. So this is one piece of the work. And then there is another. The other one is that I've been talking about diagnosis and treatment. I haven't talked quite as yet about something that comes upstream. And what happens upstream? According to the American Academy of Pediatrics, pediatricians, the medical home for every child in this country, needs to screen children for autism at the age of 18 and 24 months. Unfortunately, the paper and pencil screeners that they currently use misses more children than he identifies. Misses more children than they identify. What does that mean? It means that now we haven't identified these children, and they will grow old with their autism, and they're going to be diagnosed only later on in life. In other words, we need to empower primary care pediatricians with better tools for screening children, because that's the beginning of that odyssey. But in order for the odyssey to unfold, we need a beginning. And right now, for many, many, many families, there isn't a beginning. because the screening tools available to primary care pediatricians are not doing what they're supposed to do. So we have two projects that focus entirely on that. It's for the same tool called Early Point for population-based screening of children ages 18 to 24 months, because those are the ages of the well child visits that the primary care physician needs to screen them for autism. But NIH had a competition a couple of years ago in which they wanted to push us further. They wanted something that would be that would work for children under the age of 12 months. So one of our NIH-funded projects is this. It's called First Focus, and Warren leads, of course, this and most of these other projects that I've mentioned to you before. But we built two vans with the device inside, and those vans, they go to primary care pediatricians' offices. They park outside the office, and as soon as the infant completes the 9-month well child visit, they jump into, well, they don't really jump. Their caregivers usually bring them into the van. They complete the procedure, and we follow those children all the way through the age of 3 years. So the results that we're getting so far have been extremely encouraging. So we should look at on the horizon at the possibility that we might actually identify autism and/or developmental concerns at the young age of 9 months. And
that's amazing.
So that is possible, and then we're going to have to find out what do we do about it.
Well, I mean, I hope we can get there. That would be a game changer. And just the fact that right now is that you're looking at being able to enhance screening tools and provide earlier and earlier knowledge. And for those that have missed, now there's an option that you all are looking at to be able to kind of say, those gap years, we missed you early, but we're going to continue to build on the tool. And as a clinician, I will say I love the fact that we're looking more detailed into outcomes, is that it is so individualized how we're looking at it, and to see something on the aggregate that you can actually have an objective understanding of how the treatment is affecting each one of the children, or as an organization, how you're performing. That's something that helps to really push the needle down and make us strive for better care. Where are folks able to reach out or understand or get resources on some of these groundbreaking ideas and research and contributions that you're making, Dr. Klin?
Well, you can always take a look at the publications. They are usually a good source. For example, 3 of our clinical trials were published simultaneously in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, and one of their affiliates. So the important name for you to remember is Jones Warren, an easy name to remember, and my name is Ami Klin. But if you look at our publications, not only the publications on the clinical trials, but on the science itself, over the years, we're able to show, for example, that some of those measures we've collected of babies from the time they were 2 months of age, we follow them monthly until the age of 3, and data collected in the first 6 months of life were highly predictive of diagnosis at the age of 36 months, and also the level of disability. So that was one. The other one is showing the genetic structure of this behavior, the fact that this is a highly heritable behavior. That's another one. So the publications is one. The device is being disseminated by Early Tech Diagnostics. Early Tech Diagnostics was launched by Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, one of my 2 parent organizations, the other one being Emory University School of Medicine. But Children's is a nonprofit, is the very large pediatric healthcare system serving Atlanta in Georgia. And even though the device was funded almost entirely by a philanthropist, Bernie Marcus, the co-founder of Home Depot, and a philanthropist that basically invested over $2 billion to a whole bunch of of great causes, including medical research, and of course founded the center that I direct. He basically made a bequest of his ownership of this company to Children's Self-Care of Atlanta with the sole purpose of ensuring that if this company is successful, it's going to return their funds to autism treatment. But early tech diagnostics is a good source. If you just look it up online, you're going to see quite a bit there. And then, of course, a lot is reposited in our center, the Marcus Autism Center, and you can reach us at www.marcus.org.
Well, I appreciate the time that you've given us today. And I mean, once again, is that I've gone through another podcast and I feel more inspired, more educated. And I'm looking to kind of, I know I have to wait, but in a year or two, I'm hoping that we have the option that this becomes more mainstream and that you have the ability that it's accepted by all of the funders of autism care, because I think that that's where it's going to make the biggest difference, is that all the work that you've done on the research end, we have to find the vehicle to bring it to market. So I appreciate your time today, and hopefully we can have you back on again and get to hear more and more about where the products have gone and where we need to be looking in the future.
Thank you so very much. I'll just give you a couple more sentences then. For the parents out there, you are the greatest ambassadors for the field of science and for improving access to care. So don't doubt your power, including of self-organizing. Many parents out there do not have a platform to advocate for their children. So look out for other parents, support other parents, and most of all, hold people like myself, the academics, the researchers, the clinicians, the health system as a whole accountable for your futures, for your child's future. You have the power to do so, and thank you so very much.
Well, thank you, Dr. Klin. Thank you for listening to Autism Weekly. We hope you tune back in next week to learn more about autism in the real world. Autism Weekly is now found on all the major listening apps, including Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Amazon Music, and more. Subscribe to be notified when we post a new podcast. Autism Weekly is produced by ABS Kids. ABS Kids is proud to provide diagnostic assessments and ABA therapy to children with developmental delays like autism spectrum disorder. You can learn more about ABS Kids and the Autism Weekly podcast by visiting abskids.com. Thanks for tuning in. See you again next week.